recording. Hold on a second. All right, welcome to our member call with an introduction to composable commerce. Thank you, Casper from Valtech, for hosting us. Let me just hand it over straight away and get started.
Thanks, Janos, and thanks for hosting me once again. So, hello, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Casper Rasmussen. I'm Global SVP of Technology here at Valtech, and I'm also sitting in the Community Council of the MACH Alliance, and I'm pushing both internally and externally the agenda of MACH, and obviously the introduction of the composable commerce types of architectures that also support that paradigm. So today, I want to really just facilitate as much as I can just a dialogue with you guys too. So please do feel free to cut me off, feel free to ask questions along the way. For the ones of you who attended the introduction to the MACH Alliance that I did back in Q3 of 2021, there is a bit of repetitive context here, but I want to make sure everybody understands the importance and why we need to think about these ways of working. And then I also want to dive into some of the benefits and kind of show you guys just a bit of under the hood without it being too detailed. I know we only have 30 minutes. I really want to start by making a statement that is pretty clear to all of us that are working within the digital industry. This is something that René Magritte said back in 1929 about this is not a pipe. And this is actually something that translates quite well into our situation, our reality with cars are not cars and stores are not stores. The future of commerce needs to be way more value-centric and service-oriented by design, meaning a CPG type company is not only a provider of product anymore. They are equally the provider of value, and they are also the provider of services that hinges on the products that they actually bring to market. It means that brands now more than ever must create highly personalized and product and service-oriented types of experiences to really generate stronger emotional equity. If we look a few years back, everybody talked about direct-to-consumer, really started to talk about how companies need to go direct and how we see like a first-party commerce economy really emerging. We saw the consumer interacting with retail, directly with the manufacturer, doing finance through credit cards, and obviously using distributors and the likes for actual logistics. If we look today, we talk about this actually being the era of the shared ecosystem, an ecosystem where different actors are wearing different hats and take different roles within the overall commerce ecosystem more holistically. It means the consumer is still at the center, but this type of model is really, really unpredictable by nature. If we went back a few years, who would have predicted that the car now becomes the assistant, the phone is now your wallet, your financing solutions like Klarna is now a marketplace, and the social media platforms are boutiques and windows into organizations. We also see the gig economy starting to operate as the logistics, and obviously the actual retailer starts to become the pick-off point of product, meaning do they now start to actually play the role of the distributor? So you really start to see a lot of fluidity, you start to see a lot of differences emerging within this space, which has one underlying type of characteristic, it being incredibly unpredictable. So in our view, the future of commerce is incredibly interconnected, it's flexible, and it must be reactive at its core. And that is something we need to go in and support in the way we actually build out solutions for our clients. The interconnected nature comes from we may need to provide products to Klarna to make sure those can be sold on marketplaces where potentially the bank provides Klarna with my credit worthiness. So I can buy an item and have it delivered by Uber on my phone, obviously. You can understand the level of exchange, the level of chaos in the entire, let's call it actor model, that needs to go in and support. Of course, the flexibility comes from architectures and solutions that are by nature very pluggable and replaceable. The decision you make today may no longer be a valid decision in a year's time. And the companies that go in and try to predict the future 2 to 5 years out will have a very, very hard time on nailing that on the head. So we need to be reactive in order to navigate that chaos that companies today are actually facing because, funny enough, in a shared economy, companies are no longer in control. That was the previous era where it was a first-party company, it was a first-party type of environment and ecosystem that we operated within. What we believe as being the solution to some of this is fundamentally composable commerce. And composable commerce, as let's call it principle, leads with purpose, meaning with the business in the lead, we focus on how do we optimize the experiences as much as we can, where we place the customer in the center, but we hinge everything on value creation. It means we bring best of breeds into the mix. And these best of breed tools allow us for commodity tech to make the right choice and solve for the right type of problem. So instead of finding a big hammer, you find the specific tool you actually need for the job. Also, through composability, we create the necessary amount of scale we need to. And scale is not just in regard to volume, but it's equally in regard to how can we actually morph and change to adhere to the type of ecosystem we are in. And by doing that, we go in and compose the tools and capabilities that are being made available by those best of breed types of tools. And one thing that we see as being very important with composable commerce is that we must enable evolution over revolution. These types of cloud native solutions allow for us to gradually introduce the picture or introduce the paradigm of composable commerce over time. So this is also where we talk about you entering the era of composable commerce instead of you migrating to it. So we also believe that it's an evolutionary step for many companies to actually become more composable and start to indeed introduce some of these core qualities and some of these core principles as they are fit for the actual company and the problems they are to solve. Any questions or thoughts or comments so far?
Don't be shy. I'll manage, even though if Casper asked for interruptions. Do feel free to ask.
Yep, and I'll be happy to also move on. So in short, if you think about composable commerce, you need to think about this being the holsters of digital capability, and not just digital capability for your website or for your mobile app or digital capability for your chatbot, but the entire footprint of your digital commerce business. So we are actually here talking about composable commerce being your digital business. It's the infrastructure on which you run your digital commerce businesses. You can combine these types of digital capabilities in many ways. That's why it's referred to also as Lego blocks that you can go in and compose and make sure actually fits the bill. And by combining, organizing, and orchestrating these types of capabilities, you are serving the needs that constantly evolve or emerge within the context of both your business and the client. So if you have new business models that need to actually emerge in order to tap into new revenue streams, you have pre-existing capability you can reconfigure and benefit from to achieve acceleration. And on the flip side, when you start to have new emerging needs within your customer space, whether it's your audience's shifting preferences or whether it's you trying to penetrate new markets, you also have capabilities you can actually pre-configure or potentially adapt to make sure those are also being put in play. If we start to talk about what composable commerce now finally also does to businesses, is it actually realizes the total experience. And I don't know how many of you guys are following Gartner, but last year, I think it was January 2021, Gartner started to coin the term total experience as being the next generation of customer centricity. Total experience is about how do we combine the user's experience that sits within the actual CX and the UX with the employee's experience that actually sits on the employee side in regard to people and process. And they are talking about the notion of MX2, which is multi-experience, because by nature, all our audiences, whether it's our customers or our employees, have multiple different interfaces that they need to interact with in order to do their job. Composable commerce allow us to balance the need for innovation on the UX and CX side, meaning rapidly allow for customers to change behaviors or rapidly allow for touch points to emerge. But on the flip side, and this is what has been incredibly difficult with other types of architectures, is we can also protect people and process on the way. We can actually deploy through an API first type of an approach some level of continuity and some level of, let's say, constant on the business side in regards to how are these solutions operated, how are they maintained, how are they derived insights from, and so forth and so forth. Meaning, finally, we can actually achieve that human-centric experience that Gartner is talking about too, which is fundamental for business transformation. That's not just about rolling out new touch points.
So, Casper, before you move on, I think total experience is kind of a good slide to pause on. But Martin from Switzerland asked in the chat, when you operate in a digital ecosystem, how important is it to align with industry standards? Can you really be an orchestrator?
And sorry, Martin, can you elaborate on that question?
Yeah, sure. So you talk about the new ways of collaborating with digital components and APIs. So I was just wondering, and you also mentioned the role of orchestrator. So can you be an orchestrator in such an ecosystem? And yeah, because it seems like everybody plays a role, and how can you steer or manage that? Or maybe those are the wrong terms. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe orchestrator is not necessarily the right term, because I think every brand is responsible for their own presence. And it's about actually enabling that presence to be, I guess, present within touch points through which our consumers interact. Meaning, are you orchestrating Klarna? No, absolutely not. But you're managing your presence within the marketplace through which other players are also playing. And I think making sure that you actually allow for that as a company. So Klarna, as an example of being an emerging touch point for commerce, for let's call it a CPG trying to go direct, like that's a very, very important touch point, because it's almost the Muhammad mountain analogy in being, are you moving Muhammad to the mountain, or are you moving the mountain to Muhammad, right? And sometimes as a company, you need to truly also just think about, do you actually have the presence in the market to move all of the consumers to you, or do you actually need to bring your product and your service to market where the consumers are? And that's, of course, where marketplaces, that's where voice technology, that's where social media and so on play a very, very important role. And these types of approaches with composable commerce, for instance, allow you to start to actually integrate your services into those touch points that are constantly changing, meaning tomorrow, maybe the slide is going to look different. I don't know. Nobody really knows what the next emerging types of like the type of touch point would be where people interact with brands. I think we can only try to predict. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yes, let's go to Radiometer. Guy?
Yeah, hi. Interesting. I'm coming from IT. I've previously been in marketing. And sometimes a lot of time is spent on service level agreements, support agreements, license costs, maintenance, hosting, and all that. And if you have sort of the old school centric approach, or sort of commercial suite approach, that is an easier task.
Yep.
So how do you see maintenance and costs, and if you have 2 or 3 or more off the shelf, best in class, as you said, or best of breed tools, they all each have to be maintained, trained within, supported service level agreements based. Yep. And all that. How do you see that come into play?
So you're absolutely right. This is an incredibly complex piece to manage, because typical procurement processes does not allow for the level. Sorry, there's a big echo now. Maybe it's gone. So the typical standard procurement process does not fit very well with the need of actually procuring services and, let's say, capabilities from multiple different vendors. So you're absolutely right in that. And that is where we as also agencies and consultants come into the picture, meaning we actually guide companies through that process. And also I made the statement of composable commerce is not something you migrate to, it's something you transition into as well. So we also find the right place to start. So even though you may think that you need to sign like 10 different types of vendor contracts in order to get started, that is typically not correct. You actually need to find the right place to start your transition into these types of architectures. So sometimes that comes with a commerce best of breed, sometimes it comes with a Agile CMS, sometimes it comes with a best of breed solution for search and merch, and sometimes it doesn't. It really also depends on the type of transition path you choose. I also know that in order to start to streamline and remove this barrier of entry, the MACH Alliance is also advocating and trying to normalize some of those approaches to licenses, approaches to consumption, approaches to SLAs across those major players in the best of breed marketplace, to make sure that this type of procurement process also becomes that much easier. But it is a very difficult process today. And when you get the typical question around like ROI and you start to understand the TCO of these types of solutions, it is much harder to predict than it is if you're working with a typical suite type of a tool. That is for sure.
All right, and there was another question here while we stay on the total experience slide. That's from Sus and Egmont asking, are the frameworks like Agile, ITIL, and different standards that most of us follow geared for the speed of this?
Yes, it is. I would absolutely say it is. So, and I would even put it this far in saying now we can finally operate at the speed at which Agile allow us to, because we can actually start to also operate this at scale with some of our vertical slicing, where we don't need to focus on components within a stack, but we can actually let our teams focus on outcome because it's by nature decoupled and independent enough for these different types of slices that exist to also operate independently. So yes, we definitely see this also from an Agile standpoint really being a great fit.
All right, Casper.
Sorry.
Back to you.
Yep, I just managed to destroy my presenter view, but I think we'll be okay.
All right.
So I just want to go into some of the nuts and bolts. I realize we've already spent 18 minutes. What I really want to make sure is that
the one slide right there that you moved over a little bit quick.
It's okay. You guys can look at that afterwards.
All right.
So I want to go into a bit more of the nuts and bolts without making this specifically an engineering type of a conversation, but I want to connect this back to MACH. Because the acronym of MACH, Microservice API First, Cloud Native, and Headless, fundamentally enable composable commerce if the implementation is organized through a composable architecture. So MACH is not necessarily equal to composable commerce, but MACH enables that to happen if you approach it right or if you utilize it correctly. So from a composable architecture standpoint, what is very, very important for everybody to understand is that there are different types of, let's call them components, that are sitting within this type of a stack. We see the experiences, the SaaS and the services really interplaying very much. From a SaaS standpoint, we also see that you can enable an appropriate blend between buying versus building. And that is a very, very key strategy for simplifying and accelerating your technical strategy, because for a lot of these types of solutions, commodity tech is involved. And this is very much where we see search and merge, AI, optimization, headless commerce, and so on play, because there are simply things you should not buy, but you should build instead. And thankfully, we have the MACH Alliance that help us kind of navigate some of those marketplaces, or navigate the marketplace of what good, let's say, build versus buy options truly is. What the composable architecture is also about is that we need to create an architecture that allows for constant evolving and fluidity, meaning our capabilities will be reutilized in different types of configurations. Like I spoke about before, maybe we want to go in and configure our solution differently to make sure we support a new business model, or maybe we want to go in and configure our solution differently to make sure we support a new market or a new brand, or what that evolution may even be. It could also be a touch point for that sake. So we need to make sure that our solution is fluid and decoupled enough and independent enough for that level of reconfiguration to constantly be possible. This creates a lot of complexity, I must say, and this is also where even the engineering field is being put to the test, because there is a lot of skill and there is a lot of expertise needed to actually execute these types of architectures too. And that is, of course, where we see agencies, that's where we see, honestly, just evangelists and so on really pushing the market and the industry right now for these types of solutions, really getting more and more market share more holistically. One thing I also want you guys to just think about is, in these types of composable architectures, you have no centerpiece. If we look at it from a suite standpoint, you often have a centerpiece around which everything orchestrates. That is where you, for instance, may have the Salesforces of the world. That is where you may have the Sitecores of the world, where everything kind of orchestrates or centralizes around. In this type of an architecture, I would say it's very inclusive and very equal, because all of the types of components you have the same exact presence, because all of them are interchangeable, all of them are 100% orchestrated, and all of them are very, very loosely coupled. And that is a fundamental principle that goes into these types of architectures. And if that's not carried through in your actual execution, you might end up building a monolith from composable systems. And that is not the intent. You need to make sure it can get pre-configured, that it is evolving and fluid enough to actually be repurposed and reutilized. Because what you'll see is that, as I said, The world is unpredictable. We don't know what the business may need in a year or 2 years downstream. We need to fundamentally be the engineers of scale. So as new capabilities and SaaS platforms are being added to the composable architecture, we need to make sure that we can scale, utilize, and manage the evolution of this architecture too. And this is really where you start to see a lot of complexity coming in, because some of these capabilities you're adding may need to be replicated. Maybe you actually need to deal with multi-tenancy in a multi-brand, a multi-banner type of an environment for retail. They may need to be reconfigured because, funny enough, some businesses have multiple different types of business models that they're executing. Maybe we're talking about B2B to C, or they may even need to be repurposed. This is really where you can start to talk about a CPG having multiple different consumer brands that actually need to go to market. And ultimately, they all need to support scale, both in regard to volume, but absolutely also in regard to presence. That could be geographical reach, innovation, fast time to market with new types of business propositions or new types of business models, or fundamentally it just needs to be able to support critical business too, meaning a lot of companies are sitting and relying on these types of revenue streams to actually carry the company forward. We see these architectures being nothing but agile and extremely fluid in how they actually evolve over time. And this is really where everybody that starts on this type of a journey really need to, I would say, embrace a few very specific practices in them actually embarking on this type of a journey. So what we've realized, and we are, as Valtech, the co-founder of the MACH Alliance, and we also have a lot of experience in our backpack in implementing these types of solutions for major global brands that has both scale and innovation and critical business models to rely on here. What we really have realized being of uttermost importance is orchestration is absolutely critical. We need to make sure that we can orchestrate all of these capabilities and the constant evolution this type of an architecture go through. This is where, for instance, GraphQL come in and help you immensely in making sure that your touch points move freely from the rest of your architecture that might change. From an orchestration standpoint, you can also start to talk about how do you actually configure SaaS, cloud, and application at the exact same time, and how do you start to orchestrate deployments across multiple different types of, let's call it, change. And then, of course, infrastructure as code is also core of what we do. This is, of course, where Terraform and the likes in making sure everything is truly repetitive in what we implement. Also, what we've seen being very important for our teams is that there needs to be a very product-centric development type of a focus or mindset around these types of solutions being built out. And again, I'm speaking from an enterprise standpoint. I'm speaking from a major brand standpoint where we need to be cloud agnostic. There needs to be room for cloud providers actually shifting, where even in some situations talking about hybrid cloud with AWS, Azure, and GCP all at once. They need to be multi-tenant friendly. How do you onboard a brand without putting them into the same box as we've done in the past? It needs to be serverless because fundamentally it also needs to be able to scale. We should take, of course, use of the commodity tech that even the cloud providers make available. And then, of course, it needs to be rooted in microservices to make sure we can also handle volume and make sure that we can actually achieve this level of flexibility in the architecture more holistically. And then what we've realized, which is a common practice, of course, is the dev and ops going hand in hand as a mindset is absolutely critical. If you're sitting with an organization or in an organization where cloud ops and software development are two separate functions, before embarking on this type of a journey, you really must go in and evaluate if you can bring dev and ops a bit closer together, because the fluidity of this type of an architecture really allow or require, I would even say, full exposure and full ownership across those two types of practices. So we also see that as being quite integral.
All right, Casper. I have two questions for you. Romain asked on any specific reason why you're using Agile CMS and not headless CMS. Have you seen any good projects where the CMS keeps the head?
For composable, no. I would say headless is an absolute must, but I think it's also important to say that some of the characteristics with Agile about it being more cloud native and also supporting webhooks and Jamstack and the likes is a must-have as well, meaning traditional headless types of content management systems where you're talking about just having APIs into your content engine may not cut it. At least we see it absolutely being beneficial to have more like agile CMS types of solutions that also operate with incremental site generation, static website generation, and some of those other concepts from the Jamstack.
All right, very good. And then the next one takes us back in time to good old Frankenstein. How do you avoid building Frankenstein based on old monolith plus interchangeable solutions while transitioning?
We do that by building out micro front ends within our teams. So what we ultimately micro front ends. So what we go in and do is we actually orchestrate the front end solution too, and we use, I would call it modern CDN type of technology. For instance, Layer 0 is a partner that we often rely on to actually stitch experiences together in what we call a multi-architecture type of a scenario. That means you can start to actually blend new screens in that are micro by nature or may actually be a combination of old and new, and fully orchestrate that on the front end too. That's one way of kind of enabling this type of a transition if you want to transition your UX and CX at the same time. We've also seen a lot of companies actually start to do the transition, whether it's in building out their front end as being a headless friendly front end first, and then migrating the actual backend stack, or vice versa, actually migrating to a more headless supported stack on the backend before actually embarking too much on modifying the front end.
There you go. Thank you so much, Casper.
You're welcome.
Any questions, feedback on the final minute here? Thank you for the questions. It felt good to do some Q&A in between. I'll share, as promised, from the meeting chat. There was also some links in there. Andrew Kumar has generally shared in there. And that's all what we had for you today. Thank you very much for joining. But more than anything, thank you, Casper. Really appreciate that you took the time to tell us about everything composable commerce, and at the very end, micro front ends. Thank you.
You're welcome. Nice to meet you all. Bye-bye.